Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Saturday, 17 February 2024. It is the 159th anniversary of the birth of Ernst Troeltsch, who was born in Haunstetten, Germany on this date in 1865. There were quite a few 19th and 20th century theologians who addressed problems in the philosophy of history, and Troeltsch was one of them. Perhaps the best known among them was Reinhold Niebuhr, because he received a chapter in William Drey's introductory text on the philosophy of history, so he's quite well known among philosophers of history, better known than Troeltsch. Also, the way that Troeltsch has been translated into English obscures his philosophical contribution. For example, the volume that has been translated as Christian Thought, Its History and Application, was in the original German Der Historismus und seine Überwindung, which would be better translated as Overcoming Historical Relativism or Overcoming Historicism. And for the philosopher, this is a much more revealing title. But we can certainly understand why a publisher would choose to publish a volume as Christian Thought, Its History and Application, instead of publishing it as Overcoming Historical Relativism, as that probably wouldn't do very good for its sales. And there's a built-in market for books on Christianity, obviously. One more thing is that much of Troeltsch's philosophically interesting work hasn't been translated into English at all. So, for example, the third volume of his collected works, which could be called, translated as Historicism and Its Problems, and the first book of which is called The Logical Problem of Philosophy of History. I have the German text of this volume, but no English translation. Troeltsch begins this volume, the third volume of his collected papers, with an opening section titled On the Reawakening of the Philosophy of History. And he starts out, quote, "If one often hears talk of a crisis in historical science, then it is less a crisis in the historical research of scholars and experts than in the historical thinking of people in general. The two have been very different for a long time," unquote. And he goes on to describe methods of contemporary history as, quote, an almost exact science, unquote. So for Troeltsch, history as a discipline was doing great and developing almost into an exact science, but the historical thinking of ordinary people in general was in trouble. So what does this mean? What historical thinking is in crisis? We've already seen in several episodes the theme of crisis is very prominent in Husserl, in Voegelin, and in several others. One clue we can find from Troeltsch's personal connections. He was a lifelong friend of the sociologist Max Weber. They had a lot of shared interests, but also very differing outlooks. Weber became famous, among other things, for what we now call, in English, the disenchantment of the world. And he gave an exposition of this in his 1917 lecture, Science as a Vocation. Quote, this is from Weber, "There are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, but rather one can, in principle, master all things by calculation. This means that the world is disenchanted. One need no longer have recourse to magical means in order to master or implore the spirits, as did the savage, for whom such mysterious powers existed. Technical means and calculations perform the service," unquote. The disenchantment of the world has had particular consequences for traditional religious belief, and a theologian like Troeltsch felt obligated to respond to this. Van Harvey, who discussed Troeltsch in his 1966 book, The Historian and the Believer, The Morality of Historical Knowledge and Christian Belief, wrote at the beginning of the book, "Of the problems of faith and history, quote, none has caused more consternation and anxiety in the breasts and minds of Christian believers than the application of critical historical methods to the New Testament and especially to the life of Jesus, unquote. Recall that in the episode on David Strauss, I talked about the application of the method of historical criticism that emerged in history and was brought to an initial level of maturity by Leopold von Ranke, then became applied to the Bible, and this had consequences. And David Strauss was one of the first to do this and to write about it, and write about it as well for a popular audience. The book became very popular, very widely read, but he himself was viewed as notorious for that, you could say, and attacked from all sides because of it. At the same time that this development of historical criticism was developing and being applied to the Bible, traditional history as a nomothetic science, as opposed to the ideographic science of history, you could say, was calling into question the larger cosmology within which the Gospels were embedded, so that whether science was understood as the ideographic description of the singular and particular, or as a nomothetic explanation of the general and the universal, either way, salvation history is called into question. This is the crisis that Troeltsch tried to address, a crisis that is at the same time a crisis of history and a crisis of faith. The mythology scholar Joseph Campbell often said in his lectures that the Christian tradition was an exception in its insistence upon the factuality of salvation history as a sequence of unique events that took place at a unique period of time and involving unique individuals. We shouldn't be surprised that Western civilization, with its distinct focus on individualism, came to maturity specifically as Christendom, with its soteriological and eschatological focus on unique and individual events and persons. This is kind of what you call a theological reflection of the profane Western history focus on unique individuals and events. But the development of historical criticism and the historical sciences eventually called the details of salvation history into question. It was the historical sciences in particular that called into question the larger eschatological framework that gave hope in the form of personal salvation in this life, particular judgment of the individual in the life to come, the beatific vision, the resurrection, the millennium, and the final judgment of humanity collectively. If past salvation can be criticized scientifically, as David Strauss criticized the Gospels, and as a natural scientist constructed a picture of the universe at odds with the mythic cosmos of traditional belief, then future salvation history is also called into question, and this calls human hope into question. By the time we get to the literary modernism of T.S. Eliot, we get this poignant expression from East Coker, which is one of the 4 quartets. I said to my soul, be still and wait without hope, for hope would be hope for the wrong thing. Wait without love, for love would be love of the wrong thing. Yet there is yet faith, but the faith and the love and the hope are all in the waiting. That was published in 1943, a generation after Troeltsch. Troeltsch's life, 2 generations after David Strauss, had seen these social forces accelerate, but they hadn't yet risen to the level that we find in T.S. Eliot, for example. There's an anecdote about Troeltsch that he went to a conference in 1896, and after a sober presentation by an aging scholar, he stood up and said, "Gentlemen, everything is tottering." And somewhere else I read that the older people in the room didn't know what to make of it, but the young people took notice of it. Make of that what you will. So there's a problem. Everything is tottering, which, by the way, Frege also said of arithmetic. But Troeltsch chose to come to this question from its historical side primarily rather than from the theological side. Obviously, he's a theologian, and his interests are theological, but he's going to come at the question from the side of history and philosophy of history. And to do this, he formulated his own principles of historical criticism. I found an interesting summary of these in the book by Van Harvey, The Historian and the Believer, The Morality of Historical Knowledge and Christian Belief, which I quoted earlier. Quote, Troeltsch argued that his critical historical inquiry rests on three interrelated principles. One, the principle of criticism, by which he meant that our judgments about the past cannot simply be classified as true or false, but must be seen as claiming only a greater or lesser degree of probability and as always open to revision. Two, the principle of analogy, by which he meant that we were able to make such judgments of probability only if we presuppose that our own present experience is not radically dissimilar to the experience of past persons. And three, the principle of correlation, by which he meant that the phenomenon of man's historical life are so related and interdependent that no radical change can take place at any one point in the historical nexus without effecting a change in all that immediately surrounds it. Historical explanation, therefore, necessarily takes the form of understanding an event in terms of its antecedents and consequence, and no event can be isolated from its historically conditioned time and space, unquote. If one holds a providential philosophy of history, or even a vaguely providential philosophy of history, these principles would pose a serious problem, though not necessarily an insuperable problem. Raymond Aron, in his Introduction to the Philosophy of History, which was written in the 30s, implied that Troeltsch was effectively tearing himself up over this program. Of his rational historical critique of religious revelation, Aron wrote, quote, "It may be that revelation falls under the attack of a rational critique, but it would be hard for a historical critique to attack it. How could a revelation have avoided borrowings from the past? How ought it to have been produced to be probable? How would an entirely human ethics give authority to evaluate religions whose truth is by definition transcendent and perhaps irrational? If Troeltsch insensibly moves from science, which is positivist by postulate, into a historical philosophy of religion, it is because his faith, stripped of all orthodoxy, implies the confusion to begin with," unquote. And Aron, in a nearby passage, identified Troeltsch's philosophy of history as a species of relativism. Quote, "Relativism is always connected with a certain metaphysics. According to Troeltsch, the development of history is like the gradual revelation throughout time of an inaccessible God," unquote. In the same passage, Aron compares Troeltsch's metaphysics to those distinct metaphysics of Max Scheler and Karl Mannheim. And I'd like to discuss the relationship between Karl Mannheim and Troeltsch, but my thoughts aren't yet fully clear on this, so I'll just say at this time that there are interesting comparisons that can be made with respect to the relationship of Troeltsch and Mannheim, worth looking into. So Raymond Aron presents Troeltsch as if he were at wit's end and his theological/philosophical project is a failure. But this strikes me as wrong. Troeltsch explicitly took up the project of overcoming historicism and relativism, which is the title of his book that was translated on, I can't remember already what the title was. Anyway, the one that's titled is about being Christian doctrine. And I think this is the kind of mistake that we see so often in regard to Nietzsche, just analogously. Nietzsche wrote so much about the problem of nihilism that he is often taken by superficial readers to be a representative of nihilism, despite the fact that Nietzsche's entire philosophical project is predicated upon the overcoming of nihilism. Similarly, with Troeltsch, he wrote about the problems of historicism and relativism, but his whole project in philosophy of history was predicated upon the overcoming of historicism and relativism. In his lectures titled Ethics and Philosophy of History, he wrote, or spoke, if it's taken down as a lecture, quote, "Skepticism and relativism are only an apparent necessary consequence of modern intellectual conditions and of historicism. They can be overcome by way of ethics and by way of the ideal forces emerging from history itself, which are only mirrored and concentrated in ethics," unquote. Troeltsch saw philosophy of history as central to his project. And we find an expression of this in a book by Robert Rabinowitz, Crisis in Consciousness, the Thought of Ernst Troeltsch from 1982. Quote, "During the Berlin years, Troeltsch turned explicitly to the themes of historicism and philosophy of history. The philosophy of history became for him the essential problem. He had lectured on questions of philosophy during his last 5 years at Heidelberg, but his full attention to philosophical matters awaited the move to Berlin, where in addition to his research, publications, and heightened political activities, Troeltsch taught courses in the philosophy of history, philosophy of religion, philosophy of culture, introduction to philosophy, ethics, and history of philosophy. His most important single work in Berlin, written during his most mature period of scholarship, was the still untranslated Der Historismus und seine Problem, a significant statement on the philosophy of history. It was in the creation of a viable philosophy of history that Troeltsch sought a solution for the contemporary European crisis in consciousness," unquote. So the untranslated volume he references in that passage is the third volume of collected works that I mentioned earlier. And the initial section of that volume is titled in translation, "The Logical Problem of Philosophy of History," in which Troeltsch writes, quote, "The philosophy of history is by no means a latecomer to science, a problem that was discovered only slowly and which at least should have been present in the outline of science itself. Rather, it only came at the precise moment when it was needed, when the needs of the worldview demanded it. It is more a matter of worldview than of historical research, and the two only came together at the moment when the consideration of the essential spiritual goals required historical knowledge, and when history demanded a fundamental classification in philosophical thinking. The need arose from both sides at the same moment and for the same reason. Cultural awareness demanded a confrontation with the changing of the great periods of culture, which became more and more known and obvious, and history demanded an answer to the question of unity, goal, and meaning as soon as it spread over sufficiently diverse areas. But both resulted from the break within the remnants of the Middle Ages and the Church, with the activity of a thinking bourgeoisie that saw a new era ahead and had to come to terms with the old times," unquote. Thus, for Troeltsch, philosophy of history appears as a kind of tool for humanity, a technology of history, you could say, and we come into its possession as a tool for thinking when the historical moment is ripe for it. And the moment is ripe when we have experienced the convulsions of modernity and the expansion of historical knowledge that requires that we make a place for ourselves in this changed era of history in which we find ourselves today. We could call this a providentialism of reason, in which philosophy of history arrives on the scene precisely when it's needed. Hegel called this kind of serendipity the cunning of reason. So for Troeltsch, it is ethics and philosophy of history that come together to overcome historicism and relativism. We find these themes again in Troeltsch's article on historiography in the Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics that was edited by James Hastings and published between 1908 and 1921. In this article, Troeltsch identified three particular problems for philosophy of history. One, the problem of finding a complete system of values. Quote, History is to be interpreted and evaluated by comparison with a system of values which it is the task of ethics to construct. Every single historical aggregate must therefore be judged by the measure of its approximation to this system or to particular standards forming part of it. Whether that judgment is carried out with a glowing personal emotion or with graphic and impressive imagery, it is always based upon such an objective system of values by which the writer may be of which the writer may be unaware, but whose validity he assumes, unquote. He identifies a second big problem as the problem of metaphysical or ethical development. Quote, it must remain an open question whether this kind of development attains its end in the present life or in a further progress of souls in a life beyond. Certainly, experience does not support the former alternative. Similarly, as the system of values can be realized only approximately, and as the possibilities of an approximation are for the individual so varied, his share in the final system must also remain an open question, unquote. And the third great problem that he identifies is what he calls the problem of individuation. Quote, every historical phenomenon viewed from the standpoint of the ethical philosophy of history bears a double character. It is, on the one hand, a concrete manifestation of the idea, having a relative right of its own, and on the other, a mere approximation to the absolute system of values. In spite of all obstacles and defects, there obtains everywhere an individual and concrete progress towards the ideal. Final perfection itself, indeed, might be conceived of as simply the sum of the individual realizations of the idea, unquote. And then after this, the encyclopedic article is quite dense and long, so I've had to greatly shorten these quotes, even though they may sound long. So here's how Troeltsch summarizes the entanglement of these three problems in the final paragraph of this article. Quote, each historical phenomenon is to be estimated by reference only to that degree of approximation to the idea which is set before it and is possible to it. In this way, every epoch has a relative justification, though it must at the same time be judged in the light of an absolute end. This shows the necessary relativity of the philosophy of history, and yet makes it possible that the relative shall appear to be included in the movement towards the absolute. The absolute in the relative, not yet fully and finally in it, but always pressing toward fresh forms and self-expression, and so effecting the mutual criticism of its relative individualizations. Such is the last word of the philosophy of history. This implies, however, that in the writing of history and the descriptions of historical phenomenon, in spite of all appraisements by reference to final and absolute values, there still remains the concrete individual character of the objects dealt with, and there remains also the non-rationality of personal life with its rightful claims in the face of all the ideals of universal value that hover before the individual human mind, unquote. I think that Troeltsch was trying to do something new, or something that I would characterize as new, but he didn't complete his project, and no one since him has seriously taken it up. In yesterday's episode on George Trevelyan, I discussed Trevelyan's essay, Bias in History, and I said that moral bias in history has been pervasive, but it has been so pervasive that it has called history into question and exposed history and historians to skepticism. It's like the ethical version of The Boy Who Cried Wolf. If you spend all of your time talking about ethics in history, and then you produce a history that's obviously ethically biased, it's going to be difficult to take the discipline seriously after that. So despite the moralizing history calling the discipline of history itself into question, Trevelyan, like Lord Acton, carved out a special exemption for moral bias in history, not merely as something inevitable and unavoidable, but as a moral duty of the historian. So, moralizing history is all too familiar to us, but I think Troeltsch is suggesting something beyond moralizing history. And I think what he was trying to do was trying to philosophically formalize the moral duty of the historian that Lord Acton and Trevelyan recognized and imperfectly formulated, but they could not bring to a mature formulation and they could not justify. And that also corresponds to what W.H. Walsh called, quote, a program for providing a standard set of moral and metaphysical ideas, unquote, for the historian, and which Walsh thought was extremely difficult or impossible. So that's what I think Troeltsch was trying to do, and it still remains an open project for philosophy of history. So happy birthday, Ernst Troeltsch, and thanks for listening.